Hello, my name is Jordan Lekumsky, and I am one of the 3D artists for Afterlight. In this segment, I'll explain my workflow and the programs I use to finish my pieces. Though I do have a general workflow, there are times, depending on the piece, that I did something completely different, and I'll touch on that a little bit as well. I will also explain some of the cutbacks and challenges I encountered while creating these models and environments. I did all of my beginning and low poly modeling in Maya. Since our game is in VR and we wanted to include a diverse amount of pieces within our environments, we generally had to keep a lower poly count for our models. I also did my UV unwrapping within Maya as well. Sometimes I used Roadkill and sometimes I used the UV editor. Here is one of the pieces where I altered my general workflow. On the right you can see a photograph I took. I imported this photo into Photoshop and altered it so that the perspective, shadowing, and cropping was even. I put this altered photo into bitmap to material to generate a height map, which you can see on the right side. I then took my low poly version of the model that I had made in Maya, imported it into ZBrush, and used the height map as an alpha stencil mask to easily and quickly generate the pattern on my high poly model. Like with many of my other models, I then used this high poly mesh as a reference to use while baking my maps in Substance. I completed most of my texturing in Substance Painter. In order to quickly texture my objects and use the same materials from multiple meshes, I used a unique tool Substance has to offer called Smart Materials. All the materials you see in the scene, the gold, white marble, and blue glazed ceramic, are smart materials I authored within Substance Painter. Smart materials are kind of like programmed materials that automatically take inputs from your baked maps in order to generate realistic materials. For example, I'm using the ambient occlusion map on this model to generate higher levels of dirt. In order to create the clothes on the statue, I downloaded a free trial of a program called Marvelous Designer. Marvelous Designer is basically a physics program in order to create custom clothes for your characters, and this program is used both by people in the fashion industry and the game industry. It was quite a challenge to learn in such a short amount of time, but it was a very fun program and I look forward to getting it for myself. I also wanted to create some custom clothes for our own characters, but that was one of the cutbacks that needed to be made as there was not enough time. I'm going to finish up here by explaining some of the particle systems and special effects I created in the Cascade system in Unreal. For the most part, I made the waterfall and the fire effects that you see when generating fireballs or firewalls. For the waterfall, I used two instance materials that basically use the same sprite texture, and here's one of those instance materials. The firewall and fireball were a bit more complex, as I not only used some sprites for particle systems, but I also used some animated materials. In the fire materials, you can see that I use 4 different types of textures. Some are colored, some are grayscaled. Most of the grayscaled textures are used for warps and warping the texture. At the end of this material, you'll see a function called blackbody, and this was a function that I discovered while creating this material that really helped create a realistic fire effect. It helped with the temperature color, it helped with the lighting effect, and that was the final node that really drove home the fire feel. I did use some outside resources as well. Turbo Squid is what we pulled for most of the plants and foliage, and Substance Share holds a lot of good smart materials, and masks that we also downloaded for use in our game.
Hello, my name is Amanda, and I am one of the artists that worked on Afterlight. I'm going to briefly go over my general workflow while working on this project before delving into the specific objects that I created for the game. The general workflow that I followed for this project involves a lot of batch modeling and then batch texturing, where I basically went through and I modeled a bunch of stuff one after another in rapid succession before dumping them all into my texturing program and texturing them one by one, sometimes also in groups. You can see I textured a lot of the building pieces together, and I also textured similar objects like the wagons, which I'll touch on later. My modeling program of choice for this project was Autodesk Maya, and then I completed all of the texturing in Substance Painter. Substance Painter allows for a really streamlined texturing workflow where they will automatically bake out certain maps like a normal map from a high poly mesh or a ambient occlusion map so that you don't have to go through and hand paint it like you would in Photoshop. I focus mostly on creating assets for the marketplace area as well as 2 staff weapons for the fighters. The buildings were broken down into several different modular pieces that were group textured together so that they could seamlessly tile between each other. This allowed us to create a bunch of different buildings of all sorts of configurations without having to obviously repeat the same building over and over again, which led to a greater variety and kind of keeps the eye from noticing specific patterns between the buildings. It's also a good time-saving technique to model in modular pieces because then you don't have to worry about creating a dozen totally unique buildings. You can just break it down into small sections and maybe create 24 pieces that can then be configured into as many different buildings as you want. The rest of the marketplace was populated with a variety of other miscellaneous items that I created. Most notably, there are the wagons and supply boxes that Jordan then populated with her fruits and vegetables and other knickknacks that she created, as well as the vases that some of the vendors are selling, which for fun, I also created destructible meshes for them so that the player can go over and punch them or toss them around and they'll shatter on impact. On top of that, I also created the lotus lamps. These are little lotus flowers that sit in the water and they have a little magic flame that lights up the area around them. There are 2 different versions. One version just kind of floats on its own in the water around the Colosseum, and the other one actually sits in square lanterns that hang from the sides of different buildings. The 2 staffs that I created for the fighters are very different in design. One of them was reminiscent of a dream catcher, but in the center there is a little spinning galaxy instead. And it just has a standard metallic handle on the bottom with a emissive light at the end of it. The second staff is more akin to a royalty crest. It has a bunch of gemstones on it, and the centerpiece is this multicolored opal gem that ties the whole thing together. This staff is also complemented by its handle, which is a more informal, kind of twisted wooden oak piece that gives it this sort of whimsical feel to it. Unfortunately, there were a few pieces that got cut due to time constraints and general issues with migration and other programs. All of our character models were generated using Fuse and then rigged and animated in Mixamo.
So, to start things off, I built some enums and structs to kind of organize some data that I thought we were going to be using. As for the enums, the only one we ended up actually using was not this one. Using fighter states, we kind of just broke down the actions of what the fighter would be doing in combat and made them enum states so that we could easily transition between animations. The player info struct is where everything kind of got combined, and this was kind of useful, especially because we can, as you see here, kind of both use stats and player characteristics, which are structs themselves in this kind of container struct. So when it comes to the combat, that was kind of where we started for a lot of the functionality. We kind of had the idea that we wanted to not use that many buttons, and we would have rather just use a single button and sort of measure the motion, and so we could have all these different types of inputs or different types of moves that could produce different effects. While that kind of worked out for the most part, we had to make a few changes to sort of allow that idea to work. So the first thing we did was with the trigger, we create 2 variable transforms so that we can draw an arrow, and we get direction vectors so we know which direction it needs to draw the arrow. We input that into draw arrow, and it kind of creates this debugging arrow so we can kind of test, okay, how far did the person move their hand through space. So this was kind of like the clean version of the wall calculation. We had a not so clean version of the wall calculation that appeared. But doing something usually if you do something twice, the second time it's going to be a lot better. So that brings me to the AI, which was by far the biggest technical hurdle of this project. One huge thing about AI that I learned through this process was creating this sort of like fallback task for weight. Root would basically, as I was building, I was getting a bunch of failures. So root kept flashing yellow, which meant that it was basically defaulting back to root every time. So there's this idea of using a fallback task that is basically just a wait command that you can put for any time, maybe 2 seconds, just to see kind of where your logic is. All of the animations need to be driven by the logic, so they need to be connected to the blueprint in some way. And that's done through the animation blueprint. And kind of like we thought about with inventory objects having a universal sort of character. That's our attempt here to do that as well, where we have a universal animation set that all the characters can use, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel for each character. And that kind of is being driven by this enum player states, which corresponds to these XY values in the blend space graph. So when we initialize the GPU sprites, this sort of allows us to increase the number of particles that we're using as they're all being rendered out in the GPU instead. So one technical thing to note is if you do that, you need to make sure your bounds are clear and set, because if your particle system gets out of these bounds, it simply won't render. What we did here is we duplicated the default Unreal font material and use this function, align mesh to the camera. And what that does is wherever the camera is looking, this mesh will look at the camera. And by putting it in 3D like this, it's kind of layered and it's grouped in certain ways that kind of lets you know what information you need. So if you know where your health is, you can sort of look in that direction very quickly and you don't have to worry about the flatness.